Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 244. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author Cynthia Moore about her new book, Dancing on Coals, a memoir of an overperformer, which tells the story of her life thus far in two parts. The first is a 20-year journey in experimental theater. She spent those 20 years traveling, performing, creating her own theatrical pieces, and literally throwing herself against walls. The second part of her story is her pivot to obtain her master's degree in clinical psychology and spend the next 20 years working as a mental health counselor. Cynthia went from living a performative and physically expressive life to one of calm, introspective reflection. Her life has been a roller coaster ride, full of childhood trauma, travel and adventures, personal creativity, and extremely hard work, both physical and emotional. In this episode, I'll chat with Cynthia about her writing journey, what led to her pivot from performing to counseling, and the meaning behind her title, Dancing on Coals, as well as a few other things. Coming up. Cynthia Moore, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Thank you, Stacey. Glad to be here.
I thought what we could do today is start by talking about your new memoir, Dancing on Coals, a memoir of an overperformer. If you don't mind, tell us a little about this book and what inspired you to write it.
Well, my life had sort of two sections to it. The first section, I was involved in experimental theater. I was in the theater for 20 years, performing with sort of high octane, very physical, very athletic, physically trained groups, mostly male. And it was the first half of my life, I like to think of it as a performative half, a little bit desperate, you might say. I came from a traumatic childhood of sorts where I wasn't given the home that I needed, the belonging that I sought. And so I went into the theater for the wrong reasons. You know, I went into the theater looking for validation, looking for confirmation. And there was something missing from that half of my life, even though it was a really exciting, creative time of life and time in the theater in the 70s and the 80s. So I pivoted about halfway through my life and I became a therapist. Went back to school, got a master's degree, and so you could say I transitioned from a performative, very externalized mode of life into a much more introspective, intuitive, contemplative. I took up meditation and I began working with people on their inner lives. And so it was a big pivot, and the book was my attempt to make sense of this.
What I found interesting with the book is that you begin the book. Well, I found a lot of things interesting, I should say. A lot of things interesting in the book. But you begin the book kind of at the end. And I don't necessarily mean at the end of your life, because we're obviously not there yet, but sort of at the end of the section of your life you wanted to talk about it. And it was almost as if to say, at least it felt as a reader, as if to say, hey, I'm okay, but now let's begin. So what was the intention behind starting at the end before beginning at the beginning?
Mm.
And was that always the plan?
I think your take on it is actually very astute. I wouldn't have maybe even noticed that I did it for that reason, but I love what you're saying. I'm okay. When you start with I'm okay, you give the reader a taste of where we're going, of the whole trajectory, so that there's not just this, oh, I suffered, oh, I went through this, oh, I went through that, but there is a sense that we're going somewhere and there's a plan here or there's an outcome here that will be hopefully helpful to the reader in the long run.
Yeah. And it very early on establishes that there is a a gap, a huge divide from where we end up eventually and
Mm,
where you begin talking about your life. So because we see the end right up front and then we sort of start at the beginning after that, there is a big gulf between the two. So you realize that this is a journey
mm.
without a lot of indication just how, like in your write up, how bumpy a roller coaster ride that it will be.
Mm,
So let's skip from the very, very beginning to the beginning.
mm.
And I'd like to talk about your, as you mentioned, your childhood was unique. It's not something a lot of people have experience with, or how you went through childhood
Mm.
is unique. So can you give the listeners or the readers a taste of that?
Yes, absolutely. I was fortunate enough to grow up in the Bahamas. My mother divorced my father and remarried, and they were both retired at that point. So they moved to Nassau in the Bahamas, which was an incredible place to grow up. But the timing was also strange because at that time it had been a British colony for hundreds of years. And at this point, the Bahamians took the government back. And so there was a bit of a revolution in the streets, which caused my parents to pull up stakes and leave and move to Switzerland. So they pulled up my stakes as well and put me in boarding school in Switzerland when I was just 11, which was pretty devastating for a young child who doesn't know the language, doesn't know the culture, and has lost her friends and her home and everything she recognizes. So that was the point of what I'm calling trauma. That was the point of desperately looking for home and begging my mother, would you please let me come home? I'll do anything to come home. And she couldn't. She had a tragedy of her own. The child she had in that marriage was developmentally disabled. And so she was really suffering at that time. They were both suffering. So I was basically on my own from the age of 11, which catapulted me into this lifestyle of looking for home, looking for belonging, looking for groups to belong to. But it was growing up in Nassau and moving to Switzerland was also an incredibly rich life. So it was painful but rich at the same time.
As you mentioned, you were very young when you ended up in boarding school, but you ended up surrounded by girls much older than you.
Right.
So once again, not quite, even if you had been their age and they had accepted you, that would have been one thing, but you were so much younger than a lot of them, which made it even more difficult, I'm sure, to
Yeah.
to fit in. As you mentioned, that led you to looking for belonging. At what point did you discover the theater?
Well, when I was 6, I don't know if you remember Yul Brynner, but he was doing a touring show of The King and I. And they came to Nassau when I was only 6 years old, and my ballet school provided the children for his touring company production of The King and I. And so I had to dye my hair black and dye my skin brown, which was racially inappropriate, but fabulous for me. And I fell in love with the theater. I fell in love with performing and that sense of belonging that you get from being on the stage. So that was my first exposure, and I never turned back after that.
So after trauma of boarding school and you become a young adult and you're entering adulthood, how do you find yourself performing experimental theater, and not just sort of any experimental theater? I mean, we're talking like athletic, aerobic, almost violent experimental theater. So, how do you get from the 11-year-old boarding school girl to on stage with this all male performing group, throwing yourself at walls and things like that?
Well, it was 1970, and the 70s were a time of great creative explosion. The theater was erupting with different directors and teachers creating new kinds of theater, not just the standing around reciting lines from plays theater, but a theater that involved the entire body, that involved incredible training. And I was lucky enough to be invited to join a training group when I was in college. And we went down to Curacao in the Netherlands Antilles, which is a story in itself. We lived in an old abandoned manor house with no windows, no doors, no electricity, no plumbing. Slept on the floor. And we were trained by a Belgian director by the name of Toon Berlin, who was teaching Grotowski method theater, which was all the rage in that day. And Artaud was teaching in those days. Artaud, Peter Brook, Grotowski, Joe Chaikin. There were just incredible theater directors in those days. So we trained physically really hard, 8 hours a day. And as you said, it was mostly male, and I was trying to keep up. And it was perfect for me in a way because there was a form of perfection to attain. You could be really good at it if you trained in the way that they wanted you to train. And so I succumbed to this somewhat abusive form of training in order to get the approbation that I was craving.
And this leads you on quite a journey, and you end up in California, where performing takes on sort of a whole new level at this point, right? The troupe is small, you're getting notoriety, branching out, doing things largely of your own creation. So it sounds like the normal trajectory. You're finding success, and this is all going great. What happens to make you decide enough? I'm going to change.
Well, we were getting success on the level of um, what I call the currency was testosterone. We were highly athletic, highly physical. It was an all male group. The men were very expressive, extroverted, out there. And I always felt that as the only woman in the group, there was something missing for me. I was somehow a role. I was the woman. And there was something that was not congruent for me in that. I was very physical. I was expressing testosterone myself. I was getting success on that level and recognition on that level. I think the critics called it pyrotechnics. We were recognized for our pyrotechnics. And I wanted to I wanted to create something that was more nuanced, more lyrical, more internal, more of a language of the interior than the exterior. And I wrote a piece called Twin, which was a story of two women. And the play itself won an award, but when we performed it, it was met with a certain amount of indifference, or people were missing the pyrotechnics, they were missing the fireworks. And at that point, something just hit me. It was not what I wanted. I had been going down the wrong alley. I had been looking for the wrong thing in the wrong places. And it hit me like a sledgehammer. We have those moments in our life where suddenly you go, this is not what I intended. This is not what I wanted. This is not where I want to end up. And I always think of it in Jungian psychology, they call it the descent, where you sort of go into a dark night of the soul and you say, I don't know what it is I'm looking for. I don't know what I need, but I'm going to open up to some degree of despair and not knowing. And then you often will get some guidance that will come in and say, why don't you try this direction or think about this other way of. And so I did a full 180 by going back to school and getting a master's degrees in psychology. And it was the opposite of performative and extroverted and externalized. It was deep internal work. I had to do my own therapy, and I loved it. It was absolutely what I was craving. And so for me, that part, opening up to that, was just a beautiful pivot that was so much needed and so desired on my part.
And in the book, you talk a lot about this change, this transition. It didn't seem like that was necessarily an easy journey either. That was a bumpy roller coaster, maybe not quite as physically taxing
Mm.
as the first half, but still taxing nonetheless. And I'm sure it took a lot to learn how to live in this new life. So, can you tell us a little bit about the difficulties of ultimately being in that world and navigating it?
Well, it was emotionally taxing. And it was required when you get a master's degree in psychology and train to be a therapist, you have to do your own therapy, obviously, or you'd be bringing a lot of baggage to your work with other people. And I had to confront some of the traumas that I had experienced as a child. I had to really meet my own trouble internally, which I had avoided doing by being in those theater companies. And so that was a bumpy road. And I had to I actually brought the overperforming mentality into being a therapist when I started. I was trying to save the world. I was trying to develop accelerated courses of transformation that would heal people in 2 weeks. And my supervisors were all telling me, "You're doing too much. You stop doing so much." And it took me some years to let that sink in that actually therapy is not about doing, not about transforming people, but about presence. And about Carl Rogers always said that listening is the greatest healing factor of therapy, the ability to listen. And so it was a complete radicalization of my approach. I had to learn to be still. I had to learn to be quiet. I had to learn to listen. And I had to learn to accept myself because ultimately that's what people are coming to therapy for, is a way to be with themselves and to accept and forgive themselves and to find peace on the inside. And I knew that I had to find my own peace in order to be able to be present with that enough to help other people find theirs. And so I took up meditation and studied with spiritual teachers and tried to find ways into my own sense of um, peace and acceptance and real integration.
It's interesting that you mention that because I think people assume, or at least want to assume, that their therapist knows all the answers and is perfectly at peace themselves, right? No trauma, and that they are where we should be heading, right? That's maybe the goal. But I mean, their therapists are human like everybody else, and they have their own work to do. So it's an interesting insight into that. And I imagine who you were as a therapist when you started is different from who you are down the road as we get to the end of the book. That's, again, a huge journey, but a
Mm.
much quieter one than the first half. But it's still a journey
Mm.
nonetheless. Was there anything that you, looking back now, that you wish you had known about that journey? Because you were going into something that you really hadn't experienced that much before. Was there anything that would have been helpful to
Mm.
know then to make that journey smoother? Or do you think it still would have played out the way it did, regardless?
I think it had to play out the way it did because I had to go through that excruciating training internally that I went through. But I think what I would have liked to know was that um, I took up meditation. I took up Buddhist meditation with the hope of transcending all my suffering. And I really thought it was going to be a direct line to bliss and transcendence and avoidance. And
Just skip over it.
just skip it, just skip it. What they call now a spiritual bypass. And I wish I had known that because now I think the most potent spiritual lesson I've learned in my lifetime is that real enlightenment is about being with what's here right now, even if it's it, painful emotion, especially if it's painful emotion, being able to be present with that. And that is such a deep, profound lesson that I was completely unaware of for maybe the first 20 years of my training. I didn't know that at all. And so I did spend a lot of time trying to transcend difficulty and ultimately failed. And that was where I ended up was becoming okay with difficulty and learning how to navigate difficulty and learning especially how to be present with other people navigating difficulty because therapists have blind spots. We all have areas where we're uncomfortable or it's too much or we shy away from certain feelings and that's not in the client's best interest. So an ability to have a wide palette where you can tolerate every form of suffering and struggle and be able to be fully present with that, that's the ultimate lesson.
Yeah. I also found interesting, interwoven through this, not just the learning curve and the roller coaster of your professional life, but the learning curve of your personal life, of your family life, the idea that you find family in a form very different from one you knew,
Mm.
which I think a lot of people recognize. Maybe what they initially seek is not necessarily what they need. And so I thought that was very interesting. And once again, we get a glimmer of that when the book opens, is a snapshot of once again you're okay, and we get to see your lovely family.
Mm.
But it took a while to get there.
Yeah.
The same with your professional life.
Hmm.
Was that a parallel track, do you think, with everything else happening with your life? Or was that sometimes like a roller coaster on a different track, going in a different direction? Were they in parallel or was there discord at times?
It It was very surprising how that happened because I kind of went off book, as they say in the theater. I went off script. The script from my family of origin was one of a lot of trauma, a lot of very destructive relationships, divorces, many, 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 many divorces. That's the norm in my family. Inappropriate selections for partners. And I saw this over and over and over again. And when I met my husband, David, something in me was implacable and irresistible and said, this is the guy you want to be with. And it was a knowing, not like in the movies where there's thunderclaps and lightning strikes, but a knowing that this was actually healthy. And against all my worst judgment, I followed that knowing. And I didn't succumb to, in the theater, you're supposed to really get together with other performers and have dramatic, high drama relationships with a lot of ambition and a lot of competition. And I did that a few times and wasn't really what I wanted. And when I met David, it was like, well, this is not on script. I'm not supposed to. He was an auto mechanic. And so it was very surprising when my nervous system said, this is the man for you.
I
And
imagine, yeah.
I'm proud of myself. I actually obeyed. I obeyed that instinct that said, this is the man for you because he was calming to my nerve. He was home.
Mm. Which is what you've been looking for, as we see in the book this whole time.
Right. And I don't want to say home is another person because that's not what the message is. But having another person who can support you on your way, finding your own way home,
Right,
that's important.
right, right. Well, can you talk to us a little bit about the title of the book and where that comes from? Because I'm curious, at what point did you find the title?
Well, the original title of the book was This Is Enough,
Mm.
because the premise was it's never enough, it's never enough, it's never enough. And then I saw a poem in a Buddhist magazine, Tricycle magazine, by Anne Waldman, who's a Buddhist poet. And it's called Sleeping with the Hungry Ghost. And in the poem, the quote at the front of the book is sexy ghost, a performer, a demon, a gadfly, to never have enough, be enough, get enough, dancing on coals. And when I saw that, I went, boom, that's the title for the book. It felt more active, it felt more vivid, it felt more alive than This Is Enough. So I changed halfway through and made that the title.
Now that you've written the book and you've gone through this journey, I'm curious, are you still learning? Do you think you're still on this roller coaster? Are you still dancing on those coals, or has all of that stopped?
Hmm. Not dancing, not dancing on coals. Nope, not
Well, that's
anymore.
good. Congratulations.
Thank you. Still learning though,
Okay.
always
Mm,
until I take my last breath, I will still be learning. The publishing journey has been an incredible learning experience. I will always be milking whatever I'm experiencing for the next lesson, but not dancing and not craving and not striving. Really more coming from a place of peace and just seeing what happens, being delighted in what's going to happen next.
yeah. Why write this memoir now? And at any point in your life prior to now, did you think, oh, you know what? I'm going to write a memoir. This is going in it.
I think I started it when I quit the theater. I
Mm,
think I started it then. And then I had a first draft maybe 15 years ago that was quite different from the current draft. And the reason I had to complete it now is because it's really the book itself is about integration of these two parts of myself, the external performative part and the internal authentic part. And they were both wild and they were both vivid and they were both resourceful, but I had to integrate them. And so putting the book together was a way for me to be both of those parts of myself and to make sense of both of those parts. Because frankly, when I left the theater, I rejected that half of myself. I think we often do that when we pivot. We can do a full 180 and marginalize some part of ourself that was really valuable and important. So I needed to reclaim that and say, well, that's my masculine half. I can bring that back in. She was
hmm
fun. She was alive. She wrote a book. So I couldn't have written the book if I wasn't a therapist, and I couldn't have written the book if I wasn't a performer. So both of them got to be in the book, and it was really a bringing together of all the disparate parts of myself.
Yeah. Are there more books in your future? Do you think there are? Is there anything else that you want to tackle as a writer?
I have a bunch of books.
Mm.
I have several books that I've been working on. I'm working on one now. I think it'll be the next one I publish about a young woman who meets a man on a park bench in Central Park who tells her she needs to go and find her teacher. And so she travels around the world and meets a series of female spiritual teachers. And each teacher gives her an important lesson. And I feel that that's really important to me because we don't have enough female spiritual teachers in culture, in popular culture. And it tends to be a very male dominated field. And so I really wanted to have the wisdom of women and the wisdom of women's spirituality, almost the grandmothers, the wisdom of grandmothers
Mm.
coming through this book. A little bit of humor, a little bit of tongue in cheek, but also some good lessons, hopefully. So
Yeah.
hoping that'll be my next book.
Yeah. Uh, it just made me think. Did you ever think of writing, instead of writing the memoir, writing a fictionalized version of your life story? And do you think it would have had the same impact either for readers or for yourself if it had been a novel instead of a memoir?
I started this book with all the names changed.
Mm.
So it was a little bit fictionalized, but it wasn't raw enough. It needed to be raw. In fact, the first editor that I showed the first draft to said, "This is not vulnerable enough." And I remember this is at the beginning of my therapy career, and I said, "Vulnerable? What do you mean? What does that mean?" It took me 10 years to figure out how to even do that with writing, how to get vulnerable, how to get raw. So I actually had to change the names back and make it less fictionalized in order for it to be as raw as it is. But I wrote a fictionalized memoir for my mother because I wanted to try to walk in her shoes and see why she did some of the things she did. That was very informative. I
I'm sh-
recommend it. If you want to forgive your mother, write her memoir.
ah, that's true. That would be a very interesting exercise for anybody you felt the need to forgive but couldn't, to write their story.
Yeah.
So other than this new work in progress, I'm curious what other goals you have as a writer, and I'm also curious when you found writing,
Mm,
because it sounds like, I mean, you've had a lot of lives in this life. At
mm.
what point did writing enter?
Again, when I was 6.
Ah, okay. All right. So all the way back at the very beginning.
My first book was called Cindy's Barrel of Monkeys. It had poems, it had stories. Um, I was always a writer. I've always written poetry, journals, plays. When I was in the theater, we wrote plays, we wrote our own material. I've always had that. And novels, I think I wrote my first novel when I went to graduate school. And that's self-published. That's actually called Spencer's Pond. That's available on Amazon. But I don't have ambition as a writer. I'm not, those days of ambition are over. I'm not looking for fame and recognition anymore. So even the writing is coming from a different place in me now. It's coming from a place of sharing and love of the art form, sharing of the art form, but I'm not driven. So that's a nice change.
Yeah, yeah, that sounds good.
Mhm.
Well, if people want to learn more about you and the book and things that you have going on, a new release when it's out, where can people go to find you and that information?
My website is cynthiamorewrites.com. And my email is cynthiamorewrites@gmail.com if anyone wants to connect with me that way. My book is available. Well, the first book, Spencer's Pond, is on Amazon, and Dancing on Coals is available at any local bookstore. You can order it. You can order it from Barnes and Noble, bookshop.org, Amazon. But I recommend your local bookstore because we want to keep those in business as much as possible. There's also an audio recording, which will be on Audible any day now, but it's available on Barnes and Noble if you prefer audio.
Oh, excellent.
I did
Excellent.
record it myself, which was really fun.
Oh, good. Good. So to hear it in your own voice, I'm sure that was interesting too.
Yeah, very fun.
Well, Cynthia, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast. I want to wish you luck with Dancing on Coals, a memoir of an overperformer, and your work in progress. We will keep our fingers crossed for that one. So, congratulations on everything you've accomplished through all these lives in this life, and best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thank you, Stacy. It's a pleasure talking to you.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published, as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the bookshop at the end of the internet.